Right, good evening, everyone. We're just going to leave it 1 minute or so for people to join. I'm watching the counter rise, and when it tapers off, we'll begin. Okay, right, let's get started. So, welcome everyone to this, the final day of the 2025 Cycle Touring Festival. Um, I'm sure many of you know, the Cycle Touring Festival began in 2015, and since then it's been a mixture of online and in-person events with the aim of bringing people together to encourage and inspire and share stories and to basically give people a forum where they can get excited about cycle touring again. So it's organized by volunteers, and the speakers kindly give up their own time to be here and to make it happen. But the festival does have some overheads, and it costs roughly about £1,000 a year just to keep the show on the road. And so we ask for your donations to these talks. So if you could kindly donate, the going rate is £5 per talk or £20 for the whole series of talks. And given it's the last day, you've probably already paid your £20. If not, I recommend you just do £5. Um, so when the talk gets going, there's two ways to interact with us. So if you want to talk to each other, then you can use the chat function. So you look for the chat button at the bottom of your screens. Uh, Make sure you click the drop down menu and select everyone. Otherwise, people won't see what you're writing if you're not posting to everybody. Alternatively, if you want to ask a question to Sarah and Bernie directly, please use the Q&A button at the bottom of your screens. And at the end of this talk, or towards the end of this talk, I'll be going through those questions and answers, or questions, and hopefully Sarah and Bernie will be giving us the answers. I can't always get through all of them. I will do my best, but sometimes inevitably there are a few that slip through the net. So apologies in advance if your question doesn't get asked. But normally we find our speakers are more than happy to be contacted via their website or blog or email address after the fact if you have a burning question that you need to ask them. Okay, so this evening we have the great pleasure of listening to Sarah and Bernie. Uh, they are very experienced cycle tourers. They have been cycle touring over 4,000 kilometers each year for the last few years. Bernie tells me he's 70, and he tells me that Sarah's not far behind. And they want to inspire people to carry on cycling as long as you can into your old age. And they put in more kilometers than most of us put together. So it's going to be very inspiring to hear them talk about their trips today. So they've done some notable large trips in the past. In 2015, some of you may have heard their talk on the cycling the Great Divide down the US, which, from what I've just learned, was a lot more eventful than they planned, but was an incredible achievement. And then through the years 2016 to 2019, they cycled extensively across South America, in several trips of 3 months at a time. But tonight we have the pleasure of hearing them talk about their latest trip to Laos. The talk is called from the Mountains to the Mekong, Laos from the Mountains to the Mekong. And I think you're in for a real treat. So without further ado, uh, Bernie and Sarah, welcome to CTF 2025, and we look forward to your talk.
Thank you very much. We've been thinking for years of going to this sort of area of Southeast Asia, but never quite got around to it. So in the end, 10 days before we did this trip, we decided that we were going. So it was done with minimal planning and maximum amount of adventure. Trying to. Right, we arrived in a small airport in Luang Prabang, 24 hours after leaving our hotel in Heathrow. I'm very tired as we stepped out into the 35-degree heat. Our bikes arrived, you can see on the trolley here, and I started to put them together. But then found that I had left behind the quick release mounting harnesses for our front rolls in the UK. However, we bodged the bags on the bikes with straps and rubber bungees we had with us and made the 5-kilometer ride into our central hotel. This is an animation showing our route. Starting up the top here at Luang Prabang, and initially going across the mountains in the north of Laos, which we really enjoyed. We then headed south to Pak San, which is on the Mekong, and then we were cycled along the Mekong and then round what is known as the Saket Loop, and then down the rest of the Mekong a bit by bus, and then down to 4,000 Islands at the very south of Laos, and finally across into Cambodia. Luang Prabang is a lovely city, has a calm atmosphere, and although the streets are busy with small motorbikes and a few 4x4s, the drivers are patient and ease the flow. There are pavements, and busy market streets are more or less pedestrian. We had changed $100 at the airport and some more US dollars at our hotel. In both places, they gave us the full bank rate. You only find ATMs and banks in the large towns and cities. They are also the only place you can use credit cards, usually in large hotels. All our transactions were in Lao kip. 100,000 kip is about £3.70. In the rural areas, we typically spent 500,000 to 600,000 kip a day for all food and accommodation. That's 18 to 22 pounds. While in Luang Prabang, we also bought SIM cards for our phones. Unitel gave us coverage everywhere we went in Laos. This is me buying woven nylon trouser belts to replace the quick release harnesses I'd left behind. There are plenty of Buddhist temples resplendent in gold and red decoration. In the early morning at 6 a.m., the monks process around the streets collecting alms. On one of the streets is a row of seats and an offering set up for tourists to give to the monks. There is an interesting museum, mainly full of gifts to the king and queen, given in the early 20th century, but there are also artifacts going back to the 500 AD. The markets are full of lots of different foods that we couldn't identify. Fungi in all shapes and sizes, fruit, dried fish, snakes, bee larvae. Lots of street food, mainly different meats, fish and maize grilled on barbecues. We were lulled into a false sense of plenty as we struggled to find food to eat or buy in the small villages en route. We set out on the road at 7 a.m., already 25 degrees C and rising. This is a flyover of our first day. Starting along the river,
We didn't follow the route too closely with the camera because it made us both feel seasick.
and climbing up the zigzags up to the top of the first hill, which was 1,100 meters from 300 meters at Luang Prabang, straight down the other side, and then climbing all the way back up to 1,400 meters, which at the end of the day we finished in the dark. As we head along the river for the first 25 kilometers before starting the first climb, now at 35 degrees centigrade in bright sunlight, a sight we would get very used to, paddy fields that have been harvested. The traffic was generally courteous and gave us space. The road surface started good, but as we hit the climb, the surface disappeared on every corner where it had been scrubbed out by the heavy lorries. The result is a sandy, stony surface. We have to wear our buffs to reduce the amount of dust we're breathing, which makes us feel even hotter. We stop halfway up at a small shop and buy bottles of bright orange flavoured water and cans of coconut juice that became a staple, along with bottles of green tea with lemon and honey. Despite all this, the views are spectacular and there are birds and butterflies all around. The vegetation changes as we ascend to 1,100 meters, and there are more trees, and although some are a reasonable size, there are no old trees. Different flowers appear around every corner as we climb. We can see down to the river valley below and across the mountains we have yet to climb in front. It is very hot. the view from the summit.
So here we are at the top and feeling very pleased with ourselves. We climbed 800 meters and we were about to drop down by the same amount in it took us 4 hours to get up there, and we were about to drop down in half an hour to the height we started at. We were hoping to pass a cafe on the way down. We'd seen one marked with the knife and fork on the map, but we didn't see anything. Perhaps we hadn't got our eye in yet, I think. So we ended up down in the small village at the bottom. There was a small shop with nothing to eat in it, and a river with people fishing and little boys jumping in, which looked very inviting. I have to say, we were very hot. It was 40 degrees by this point, and as we started to climb, and we knew we had 1,100 meters to climb, we were really hungry. So we made another 150 meters up, and we were so hot by this point, we were starting to feel ill. So we thought the only thing for it is to turn around and roll back until we found somewhere to stop. And there was a small shed on the side of the road, and this woman and her young child, and she had a tiny shop. She didn't speak any English, and she didn't appear to speak any Lao. I'd learned a few phrases before we set off. She didn't understand any of that, and of course Google Translate doesn't work because the Lao is not voiced, and she couldn't read. So we mimed food, and she took us into her tiny little shop with only had a few things in it, and I could see these Chinese pot noodles. So we bought those and a couple of watered down flat 7-Ups. And the main thing was to get out of the sun. So we sat in her shed along with several defunct fridges, some motorbikes and a small child on a swing. We tried to heat up some water using her kettle, but it didn't really work. So we made our pot noodles with tepid water. And it was pretty disgusting, but at least it was food. And we sat there for several hours until it started to cool down. And I think we were there for too long because we left at 4 o'clock and already the sun was going down. And just after we set off, we suddenly heard an incredibly loud bang and the ground shook. And we stopped and looked around, and I could see a car on the next hairpin bend had also stopped and was wondering what was going on. And it had been so loud, I thought the part of the hillside was going to drop or something, but nothing happened, so we carried on. And within half an hour, just like that, it was dark, 5:30, and all the mosquitoes came out and the jungle insects were buzzing. And at this point, we realised we'd left our mosquito repellent at home in England. But we didn't seem to get bitten, so it was quite lucky. And we carried on plugging up the hill, stopping every half kilometre because we were quite tired by now. Though luckily at night you can't see the hill, so it doesn't seem so bad. Though it was still very hot. And eventually, after 2 hours, we arrived in Phu Chau. And we found a guest house, only to be told they were full and there wasn't any room. But luckily, after a little bit of persuasion, they went and looked again and they found a room. I don't know if someone had been thrown out. But anyway, we found this room. It was pretty grubby and the walls were filthy and there were springs sticking out of the mattress. But to be honest, we didn't really care. We were just pleased to get in there. So after a quick wash, we went to try and find some food because that's really what we wanted. And you can do anything as long as you get fed. But we were too late for food. They'd had a large group of trainee guides in, and they'd eaten everything, and the kitchens were shut. After huge amounts of persuasion with mime and all sorts of things, we managed to persuade the lady to make us an omelette, which was better than nothing. And then we didn't get any sleep, despite the fact we were so tired, because there was a cockerel crowing all night outside our room. But despite all of that, we'd really enjoyed our first day. It doesn't sound like it, but it was amazing. The views we'd seen on the way up. It gave us a good thoughts of what was to come. So the next day, this is the front of the guest house we were staying in. We finally persuaded them to give us some breakfast of fried rice and egg, and they had some bananas for sale outside. And this is downtown Phu Chau, which really fills you with inspiration. But we were up high and we stayed up high, having got up there. It was a wonderful views with the mist rising. Early mornings in the mountains is always fantastic. And there's always these clouds rising up and it's just amazing to be up there, and this is why we do it. And we set off through the small villages, and it was heavily undulating, I think is the best way to describe it. Although we kept our height, there was a lot of climbing still. They had all the dried chilies out to dry in the sun, and grain and maize all out there drying in the sun and getting covered in dust by the lorries going by. And we decided that we were going to really treat ourselves today and have a shorter day and stop everywhere we could. So the first cafe we arrived at was this one, and we became the entertainment for the village because it was Saturday and all the children came to stare at us. But it was mainly the shade we were after. And more wonderful views started opening up as we carried along. And we were going through all the villages, and the children, all being there, were running along beside us, shouting Sabadi and hello, waving at us. And the next cafe we came to, the woman didn't need asking. She started making us food as soon as we arrived. And we got this delicious meal of rice and stir-fried pork and vegetables and egg on top, and broth, which comes with everything. And it just sort of helped set us up for the day. It's really nice. The villages we were going through, all the houses were up on stilts, or most of them. And they lived up top, and underneath they had their farm machinery and animals and hammocks. We were often quite jealous when we saw them swinging in their hammocks in the middle of the day when we were still in the hot sunshine. And a few farm animals were usually under there too. And the next night, we had a shorter day, and we arrived at Po Cam, and they were slightly bigger. So there were 3 guest houses there, and they were all on the really busy road, very dusty with lots of lorries going past, so they were quite loud. So we chose the one that had a restaurant attached to make sure that we were getting our fill. And that was good. And this is downtown in the morning as we were about to leave. We were setting off early now, and we slowly got earlier and earlier. The shops aren't open at this stage. It was probably about 7 o'clock. But as the days went by, we got up earlier and earlier. And in the end, we were getting up at 4:30, and we were leaving as the sun came up. But we hadn't quite got that early at this stage. And we were carrying on. We'd left Luang Prabang province by now, and we were in the Sieng Huang province. And we were going through the small villages, and this was a side street off the road that we were on. We had tarmac on our road, but you can see that their roads are just mud, and obviously in the rains that's going to be impassable for them. And we lost most of the lorries at the last village, and they turned off to go to Vientiane, which is the capital. But there were still a few coming towards us mainly, and they were all empty, and so they were rattling like anything. And this sort of shows a typical hill we were struggling up, and often chased by little children shouting at us. I mean, nicely, waving and calling Sabidi and hello. And this is sort of luggage that we were carrying.
We passed pockets of agriculture on very steep slopes that have been reclaimed from scrub. Mostly planted with cabbages, you can see here and over on the side there. The workers disappear down small paths on foot to tend to their plots of land. But seen here resting in front of the Mexican sunflowers that are picked and sold in the village markets. Kids of all ages seem to be about in the villages. Primary education in Laos starts at age 5 to 6 and lasts for 5 years. 71% of children are enrolled. They're supposed to be compulsory. Only 15% continue on to lower secondary the next 3 years, and only 15% onto lower secondary and 3% onto higher secondary the final 3 years. Although the youngsters all speak Lao, many of the adults speak one of the many local dialects. Motorcycles either refuel at these drum stations or buy litre-and-a-half or half-litre bottles from the village shops that all have it for sale in reused drink bottles. Again, we keep on about the views, but they really are stunning, and it's why we're always happy to cycle in the mountains. This very small village had a nice guest house with the usual cramped combined shower, squat toilet. Remember to start practicing your squats several weeks before you go. And this is a typical restaurant kitchen and living quarters in one room. Senna flower. And this is a typical small holding with cattle. We often found cattle browsing along the road banks. And the forest in Jianghuang province seemed more dense. Along the way, there are small holdings, and in villages, small shops selling sweets, cans of drink, sometimes in a fridge, which may or mostly has not been on recently. And you can see this front room of the shop, their bed, no electricity, the lady holding a handful of kip. Agriculture is mainly paddy fields in the valleys and maize or cabbages on the hillsides. And we also pass people on the side of the road selling pineapples and root vegetables. They make their haystacks on stilts to keep them out of the floodwater in the rainy season, and cattle graze on the stalks of the harvested rice. There are weavers working on the verandas or at the back of shops. Even at 6 in the morning, it is 25 degrees centigrade and climbs up to 39 or 40 by 11 o'clock. We then descend to a fertile plain, which is flattish, but at 1,300 meters, and we pass shops that are a little more prosperous and better stocked as we near Phonsavan. This is our upmarket guest house at Phonsavan, comfortable bed and cooked breakfast, where we spent 2 nights. At the restaurant round the corner, we chatted to the owner, who had this collection of bombs. He also did bomb disposal, and his father had been in the war on the communist side. This area, at the north here, was more heavily bombed during the so-called Vietnam War than any other, with 2 million tons of bombs, cluster bombs, dropped, of which 30% failed to detonate. More bombs than were dropped during the Second World War. That leaves 80 million unexploded bombs, of which only 1% have been made safe. 3 bombs a day still explode in this area, and we had heard one go off as we were cycling up the road, an ear-shatteringly loud bang on a hill not far from us. 50,000 were killed during the war, and a further 20,000 have been killed or maimed since the war. The Lao were in theory neutral, but the North Vietnamese were supplying their forces through Laos, the famous or infamous Ho Chi Minh Trail. All sides were taking advantage of the civil war that was going on in Laos between 5 different factions. It is not a country where you can wander off the track and just wild camp.
Right. The main reason we'd come to Phonsavan was to visit the plain of jars. So we set off the next day to go to Site 1, which has over 300 jars. The whole thing is a megalithic archaeological landscape with thousands of stone jars scattered over the Siang Quang Plateau in over 90 sites. They're associated with burial practices from around 1240 to 660 BC. They vary in height from 1 meter to 3 meters, depending on whether they were burying children or adults. The bodies were put in there and fermented, and then later on the bones were taken out and placed elsewhere. The site was heavily bombed between 1964 and 1969 by the US against the North Vietnamese and the Pathet Lao communist forces during the Secret War. Here you can see a trench dug up through the jars, and at the top there's a scrape where the tank was, and around about there are huge craters where the bombs had gone off. Many of the stone jars were blown to pieces during this time. We decided to only visit one site because we were tired and they were all spread out quite a long way. So we headed back into Phonsavan just to caught the end of the morning market and they either have morning markets or night markets to buy some fresh fruit and vegetables. It's the only time you can buy fresh food because the shops only have sweets and fizzy drinks mainly. And here are my nemesis, the meter-long noodles, which I really struggled to pick up with my chopsticks. And here they are in our soup that we got. Noodle soup is that they have a dish called Pho Lao, which basically means Lao food, and it's always soup. This one has a nice lot of stuff in it, which more than you get in the small villages. And you can see the noodles at the bottom. I thought I was coping quite well with my chopsticks. You have a spoon and chopsticks to cope with this. And I only had a small amount of noodles in my lap when a man came in and took one look at us and announced to the whole restaurant very loudly, "Why have you given these Europeans chopsticks? You know they can't use them. Find them forks." And I sort of crouched down in embarrassment. And the next day, we thought we'd have a short day and go to Muang, which is well known for its wots and thats. And you can see the tall wat up there. Sorry, the tall that up there, and the wat is the temple that goes with it. And when they're in good condition, they're beautiful gold, covered in gold. And on the way there, we pass these lovely water lilies in the lakes and ponds. And this is a that. And this one's been fairly heavily restored. And because this one is reputed to have the Buddha's, or some of the Buddha's ashes inside it, it's called That Kun. And not only are the ashes in there, but they have ancient manuscripts and they have a central jewelry tree inside. So naturally enough, in the 19th century, they were all raided by Chinese bandits, and a lot of them were very badly damaged and had big holes dug in them. This one's been restored. And we were cycling around the site. There's quite a few of these. And we got to a point where we just looked over the edge to see what was going, mainly to look at the town below us, and saw these people who were wandering around with metal detectors and going beep, 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 and with the markers and digging up the little bombs out of the hillside. So we decided we were a bit too close to comfort, so we beat a hasty retreat. But it's quite noticeable if you look at what they're wearing, that they haven't got any protective clothing on. We looked up the name of the company that was doing this on the side of one of the Land Rovers, and they're an international company who do bomb disposal worldwide. And if you look at any of the other countries where they do bomb disposal, all their staff are protected by proper safety equipment. So you do wonder why they didn't give them to the Lao people. And on the way back to the town, we passed this beautiful yellow trumpet bush, Dacomas stands. To just pop those in. So back in town, they were still doing up quite a lot of the wots and thats. And this is a tower with the Buddha drum, or the they call people to prayer by banging that. We saw them later. And you can see all these sticks here. In a lot of Asian countries, they use bamboo as scaffolding, but here they use these rather ropey looking sticks. And this is a that has, you can see it's been raided. There's a big hole halfway up and it hasn't been restored yet. But here next to it, that they're restoring the wat, the temple, and they got all these scaffolding up the side, which doesn't look at all safe.
And just nailed together the sticks.
And this is one that they did earlier. It's a beautiful, and this one, I have to look up how to say this because it's called That Luang Muang Phuan, and it was stunning. And the that at the back there, when we looked inside, all the old ruined that is piled up in bricks inside there that they'd kept and built back over the top of it. And they're quite stunning when they finished. So the next day we knew we had a big climb ahead of us, and we were starting off on the plain, and we were going up here into the clouds. But it was a nice steady climb to start with, and it was nice and quiet because we were going over this little rickety bridge, and none of the lorries or the big cars could come over that. I don't know if you've noticed that this fellow here, I mean, we've been complaining how hot it is. He is wrapped up in great thick woolly coat and woolly hat. And everyone we met was dressed a bit like that because they think it's cold. It's the cold time season of the year. We were there in November, and they think that's cold. We didn't. There were actually, having said that, we were becoming more acclimatized. And that morning, I had grumbled how cold I felt at 24 degrees. And so it was only us and the motorbikes and the odd water buffalo as we headed up the hill. And it seemed much poorer and much more subsistence farming up here. And these houses looked very rickety. But strangely, next to them were often very smart-looking bungalows with expensive-looking 4x4s with tinted windows parked outside. So I'm not 100% what was going on there. But as we climbed, it got more and more remote and steeper. So for the last 10K, we were in, and I think we're allowed to be because we are grandparents, we were in granny gears going up there for 10 kilometers. And eventually we got to the high agricultural village of Muang, which is an amazing place. It was quite a big village, actually, and it had a large farming plateau next to it. And we were very pleased to find that there was a guest house because we weren't 100% sure. We couldn't really see on our maps what was there. And they found us a room out the back. That they'd built a few rooms around their farmyard out the back. And it all looked fine. And I went down there for a shower. And luckily I wasn't standing under the shower when I turned it on because thousands of ants poured out instead of the water. And it was a bit like something out of a horror film. But luckily the water did come along eventually and washed them all away. So it was all fine. And then we wandered around the village a bit and looked at the farming enterprises that were going on and their polytunnels, and they were growing aubergines in there at the moment. And also they had a home weaver, and this is an area for home weavers. They were doing, she's weaving silk, and she's actually wearing a similar thing to what she's weaving. And most of the women and the school children were wearing silk skirts like that, going incredibly fast. And they had a slight party because we were the first tourists that they'd ever had staying there. She'd killed a duck in front of us during the afternoon and cooked it, and we were presented with the duck's feet and duck's bones, and they were getting very merry on the homemade hooch that they'd had. And the father, we realised, did speak a tiny bit of English once he'd had a few glasses of this, and when we said where we were going, they all seemed very worried, but they weren't able to tell us why.
This is the lady of the house, who was also the local butcher. She's cutting up the meat from a pig that was delivered yesterday. So we get on the road and do as much riding as possible in the cool of the morning. We get up at 4:30 a.m. and eat breakfast in our room, aiming to be on the road by 5:45, just as the light is coming up. Sunrise is just after 6. Most guest houses do not provide breakfast, or if they do, it's the Lao food, the noodle soup, which they seem to eat at every meal through the day. So we buy bananas, biscuits and apples and mandarins. And after we left Muang, the tarmac ran out and we were on gravel going downhill, steeply, at 20% and in some places 30%, following a cascading river. Hidden in a deep gully to our side, passing waterfalls on either side. Our hands become tired, hanging onto the brakes as it was so rough. We could not go fast for fear of losing our luggage. We dropped from 1,500 meters down to 300, passing 2 small hydroelectric plants. This road is not on the map for about 30 kilometers, but is obviously the main route. We only pass a couple of motorbikes and at the power plants a couple of 4x4s. This picture gives a good idea of how steep and rough it was. The flora and fauna change as we descend with different butterflies, birds and flowers. Halfway down, we come across a small farm and later village with a shop where we stop for drinks. Sarah uses their loo, which is out the back and turns out to have been provided for the village by an EU grant. After the village, we cross into Yangon province. This is coloured orange on the Foreign Office website. Not recommended for tourists, but we will only be in it for 30 kilometres, so we take a risk. This province is inhabited by the Muang, who sided with the Americans during the war, and as a result, when the communists won the civil war, was virtually eliminated by ethnic cleansing, and have been campaigning for their province to be self-governing ever since. We arrive at the plain, and you can see the Mekong in the background. We spend a night at Vientiane Cam in a grotty guest house. At sunrise, we start the Thakat Loop, which takes us on to the backpacker circuit. We climb up to a viewpoint, which is full of young backpackers and who have arrived on their motorbikes, to what looks like Starbucks with zip wires and suspended tree walk platforms. No local culture in sight. Then we go down a valley with the karst mountains on either side to the Kong Lor Cave. The karst mountains are made out of limestone, and then we head down this valley with the karst mountains on either side. It was quite spectacular being down in the valley and looking up at the mountains as we go past. At the end here, you can just see this hill in front of us. That's the Kong Lor Cave. We go under that. It's 7 kilometers long. This is a view across the top of the mountains from the viewpoint. And the early morning clouds drifting off the top of the mountains. And yet another that.
We decided that we didn't really fancy spending the night in backpacker land. Although we were quite tired, we thought we'd try and get through the cave that evening. So we rolled through the woods and we found this this building full of men and life jackets. It's because we had to have a boat each to take the bikes through. Seemed quite expensive at 350,000 kip, but when we per person. But when we translated that, it was only £13. So it did use up a lot of our cash. So we were given life jackets and flip-flops as we would be wading. And two guys came out and they each took a bike and set off down a steep slope and across the deep sand and disappeared, leaving us struggling behind carrying our luggage. And here I am sitting in the front of one of the canoes. Bernie had turned the handlebars on the sides so they didn't drag on the water. They also took motorbikes through here, small ones. And it's quite light here, but it's pitch dark in as soon as you set off at high speed, and our torches hardly sort of made a dent on the darkness. So it's quite a bit worrying. But after 5 minutes, we found this illuminated area, and we all got out and walked up to the top of the cavern to see all the stalactites and stalagmites that were up there. We stopped a couple of times further on as well, mainly so that they could haul the boats up through the rapids, because it hadn't rained for a month and the water level was quite low. And it looked quite worrying as they were heaving on the ropes and the boats were rocking, and we thought we might lose the bikes and the luggage. But it was nice walking along the side because you saw more of these. And then we were out the other end after 7.5 kilometers. And then we motored around, just around a few bends and stopped at a beach. And by this time of the evening, our drivers had got the measure of us and decided we needed taking in hand. So they dragged us off around the corner. We had no idea if there was anywhere to stay, but they dragged us around the corner where they owned a bungalow in this complex. We were the only people staying there, but it was really, really nice to find. All mod cons had a restaurant which had nice food in it, if a bit spicy. The only thing it lacked was hot water, but it was very comfortable. And then the next day, we had no idea what this road was going to be like. We had heard it was mud, and we had heard it was impassable if it was wet. And you can see what happens when it's wet there. But most of it had been recently graded and was lovely, solid, hard-packed mud. And to start with, it was flat and it was very pleasant. And then it got a bit undulating. And we went up through some lots of small villages, and it was very nice, and lots of lots of views on either side, and we were going up a plateau between the Karst Mountains. And we met this lady coming the other way. She was supplying the small shops and things that we were going past. And we thought, well, if she made it down, it can't be too difficult to get out. And we were just stopped here looking at the cassava fields and the mountains and the view. It was all very nice when it started to rain. Now, it hadn't rained then the whole time we were there, and this was the only day when it really mattered if it rained or not. But it did, of course. So we thought we better hot-foot it out of there. We didn't quite know how far we had to go. But of course, at that point, the hill started, and we caught up with the graders. And so they'd made a really big mess of the roads. There was lots of loose, now wet mud on the surface. We were going orange slowly, and it was really difficult to push the bike through. So we were walking. And the first hill was 3 kilometers long, so we walked that, and we thought, oh, we'll be down now, but it wasn't. It was flat for a little bit, and then the next hill was 4 kilometers long. And I was getting really, well, we were both getting really tired. I was practically on my knees when this lovely young lad drove past us and stopped and asked if we wanted a lift. So Bernie and him popped the bikes in the back, and Bernie hopped in the back. And I thought, well, how am I going to get in there? And so he suggested that I put my foot up on the flatbed there, which was about shoulder height. And I thought, right, I do Pilates and yoga. I'm sure I could do that. So I managed to get my foot up there, but then I couldn't move. So with Bernie pulling and the young lad pushing, they managed to get me flat on my face in the back of the flatbed. And I have to say that I didn't make a better job of getting out again afterwards. But once up there, it was lovely, a nice view and an engine up the front, and the hill didn't seem so big at that point. And he took us up to the top, and we could see the big reservoir forming, and we were back on concrete, or on cement, tarmac even. And it was mainly downhill back to Thakek. It would take us a day and a half to get there. So we thought, well, we'll roll down a bit and stay somewhere and carry on. But we had a bit of trouble finding anywhere to stay on the way down. But we eventually got down to the bottom at Thakek and booked into the nicest hotel we could see, where we spent a couple of days just drinking iced coffee and eating chocolate brownies. It's back on the Mekong.
Yeah, now we're on the plain through which the Mekong flows, and although we're following the river roadside, we only get occasional glimpses of the river through the vegetation on the way to Thaket and Savanaket. The national flower, the sweetly scented frangipani, and the agriculture is mainly small holdings growing vegetables on one side and rice and paddy fields on the other. It would only take a small rise in water level to flood the whole of this area. You can see that they're trying to create flood defences. The children here mostly have small electric scooters so they can get to school, which would otherwise be 1 or 2 hours walking each way. We pass through lots of villages, and everyone seems to be burning leaves from the gutters along the roadside. This bridge is undergoing repair. No road closures here for maintenance. At Savanaket, we decide to take a bus to Paksay so we don't have to 4 days cycling down the main road. Taking a bus is a first for us. The bikes are hauled up onto the roof and strapped onto a load of mattresses. At the towns, we are inundated with vendors selling street food, grilled chicken, soup, plastic bags, rice and fruit. More people got on, and when the roof and luggage space were full, they laid sacks onto the floor and the passages under the feet. At Paksay, we had chicken noodle soup, complete with feet. This wasn't great. From the flyover, you can see how wide the river is and how flat and broad the plain is that flows through. After Paksay, there's very little accommodation on the main road. And after 60 kilometres, we found a guest house at a disused petrol station, but only 2 of its 6 rooms were functioning. And we had to cycle 5 kilometres back to get food. All the restaurants were shutting at 6 p.m, and we were lucky to get a meal. Noodle soup again. From here on, there are very few villages, and on the main road, although there appear to be some on the side roads towards the river. There's a mixture of paddy fields and scrub and occasional isolated buildings. This one is actually occupied. Laos was hit hard by the pandemic, with poor healthcare and the badly run vaccination scheme. Many people lost their lives and their livelihoods. We turned onto 4,000 islands. The first island was Don Kong. And the islands effectively block the whole river, which falls over waterfalls and rapids. Hence, there's no significant boat navigation north of here. We take the bridge to Don Kong and then get a small ferry onto Don Som. Don Som has sandy tracks that take us through farmland and a couple of villages. It's 40 degrees C plus out in the sun. We're glad of any shade we can get. At the bottom, we take another ferry across to Don Det, which is a backpacker paradise with lots of cafes and bars and restaurants. All the tracks on the island are concreted, and electric buggies and bicycles and motorbikes are for hire. We cycle through Don Det and Don Kong, which is quieter but equally expensive. And we spend a couple of days exploring the waterfalls and villages on the islands. The French built a railway through 2 islands to drag ships over land to above the falls. Some of the gunboats were cut into 5 pieces and transported and then reassembled upstream. There are no facilities to change money at the border, so we ended up with more kip than we had planned. You also cannot buy a Cambodian reales there, but it didn't seem to matter, as almost everyone in Cambodia accepts US dollars. Now there's a short compilation video of our tour through Laos.
Kabari, Kabari.
Abang Haji Wani. Haji Wani.
มาได้ไทยมาตบาดมาไทยจ้ะครับหมอกันที่ยังไงตัวเขาเนี่ยงั้นตัวเขา
Right, well, I'm sorry we've rather overrun, but if you'd like to ask any questions, we're happy to try and answer them in the time we have left.
Absolutely. What a wonderful adventure. That was just marvelous. Thank you very much. We have got quite a few questions coming in. And as you say, we haven't got a great deal of time left, but I'm sure we can squeeze a few in. So there's quite a few people interested in how you planned your route and how much distance you did each day. And for instance, whether you kind of you planned your guest houses or whether they were a bit more of an improvisation.
The guest houses were very much an improvisation because you can't really find them on the maps. I tend to use OpenStreetMaps and a mixture of Google, and you can find a few more on Google than OpenStreetMaps, but it's very difficult to find, and it was just pot luck, really. We did take a tent with us just in case of emergencies, but we never actually used it. And the distances were a bit longer than we normally go, so typically about 75k a day.
Okay.
Normally we try and get down to about 60 or less.
We sort of guessed that a certain size of village would probably have a guest house.
And the route was really planned just by looking at the map and drawing lines between the few things that we knew we wanted to see, like the plain of jars and the Kong Lor Cave and things like that. So, and trying to spend as much of our time as possible in the mountains.
And there's quite a few questions. I think quite a lot of people were surprised quite how hot it was for you all. So you mentioned 40-degree heat. Is that just that time of year, or is there a cooler time of year that you go?
That was in the sun. So if someone tells you the temperature, that's always in the shade temperature. Because we were out and there wasn't a lot of shade. It was very hot.
If you look at the websites, it tells you that it's typically 15 at night and 25 during the day. Well, it was typically 25 at night and in the shade, probably about 30 to 35. But of course, out on the road, it's quite a bit hotter.
We
Mm.
don't know what it was normally like.
But I mean, we had 40 days on the whole trip, including Cambodia and Thailand. We're only 22 in Laos, and we only had an hour and a half of rain during the whole time we were there.
Okay. We've got a question here, which is, I guess, often on the minds of people when they visit these far-flung places. Was security and safety ever an issue? Did you ever kind of feel vulnerable at times?
No, it's one of well, it was a very safe feeling place, and some other people that we had met there also said it was one of the safest countries they thought they'd ever been to.
That's interesting. There's a particular query about that really large fat that you said that the beautiful that looked like it had been renovated. Where was that? I don't think you said.
Muang Kun,
And that's famous
That's-
for its stats and what's there.
Khoun, and Muang, Muang.
Okay. And there's quite an amusing question here. What are the really long tractors all about? They're quite unusual.
Well, basically they're sort of like giant rotavators, which are sort of used as tractor units, and they just build these trailers to go on the back of them. And in some of the time, actually, we didn't show a picture of it, but they pile them up, and with hay and stuff like that almost to about 10 feet high, and tow them along. But they're multi-use sort of tractor units they can use for tilling the fields or pulling things along, and they also use them to get about with. And they're just single-cylinder diesel engines of Chinese manufacture.
It's a very poor country, so they sort of making do with whatever they can manage. But unfortunately, now that some of them can afford tractors, the heavier weights are setting off more bombs, and so more of them are getting injured in their bigger tractors.
Interesting.
Because
Probably
they haven't
changing
been
the
able
road
to
a bit
farm.
more. So just to finish off, I think a lot of people are interested in where to next. What's the next big adventure that you're planning?
Well, in May, we're hoping to do the Transdinarica, which there was a talk about the other day. And then we last year we went to Uzbekistan and hoped to carry on into Tajikistan and Kyrgyzstan, but we couldn't get visa to get through, so we're hoping to go back and do the rest of the Silk Road bits.
Fantastic.
September probably.
Okay, so that's 8 o'clock. So thank you very much for joining us all this evening and for showing us all your wonderful pictures and photos and entertaining us all on this Sunday evening, this grey Sunday evening in the UK with a story of some of the adventures that are possible on a bike. So please, everyone, show your appreciation in the chat room. It'd be wonderful at this point if we could give you a big round of applause, but we can't. You'll just have to watch the chat room, and we'll send you a transcript of everyone's comments after the fact. And so next up on the Cycle Touring Festival is Cycling the Scottish Southern Islands with John Houseago, and that starts in 30 minutes time. So it's just enough time to go and get a cup of tea, and then come back and join us in 30 minutes for the next talk in the CTF 2025. So one last time, thank you very much, Sarah and Bernie. Really enjoyed it. And we look forward to seeing you here at the Cycle Touring Festival again in the future. Okay.
Bye.
Bye.
Bye.